Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. Well, welcome to another episode of Parental Alienation from the Couch to the Courtroom and Beyond. And we are talking again with Dr. Michael Bone, who is a colleague in this arena. And good morning, Dr. Bone.
Good morning. If it's morning, I'm not sure where. Yes.
Well, we're not going to say it's a new year either. So
Right, exactly.
So we're going to keep talking about the different roles that professionals have in these cases. And we thought today might be a good idea to kind of talk a little bit about the targeted parents attorney. And we could probably segue back and forth with the favored parents attorney in terms of parental alienation and what people should know about that.
Exactly.
And ideas
think,
to think about. So
exactly. I think one of the key things that's important to understand is that there's a high incidence of misinformation that a lot of attorneys have, even really good ones, because if you think about it, how they learn about parental alienation is from representing one side or the other. And so it's an adversarial thing. It's not an objective thing. So it's understandable that they're going to have perceptions that may not be objectively accurate, but just based on their own experience. So that's kind of the first thing. So attorneys might say, oh, that's been debunked. And that's just not true. But they may think it's true. So that's why I think we have to recognize that as sort of a starting point.
well, and I think one of the things I wanted to mention was, yes, they learn about it by listening to experts, and we'll put that into quotes, depending
Right.
on who the expert is and the kinds of things that they're saying about parental alienation. I had a case in the state of Washington once where it was a mental health professional, and he did an evaluation. And one of the questions that was asked of him was, well, how did you learn about parental alienation? What is it? Where'd you get your expertise? And he said, well, I think I read an article on it once.
Right.
Okay. And it
That's
was
not
like,
an expert.
oh, okay. Well, it turns out, of course, this evaluation got it totally wrong. And so misleading the judge, probably not intentionally, but misleading the judge and anyway, because of the testimony that he provided, because he doesn't really know about parental alienation.
Right.
It turns out I have a very good friend of mine who is a professor in a clinical psychology program, a university here in Tampa, and they do not even mention the words for a Ph.D. clinical psychology program. The words parental alienation do not exist in the curriculum.
Yeah.
And that apparently is almost a national phenomenon in terms of just clinical psych kinds of programs. I guess they don't have time to get into that kind of detail. This is a very unique, comprehensive, complex subject in terms of clinical psychology. And it's just simply not widely taught
Right.
in formal programs. The
And I
same with
get it.
attorneys. So it's the same thing with
Yeah.
attorneys. There is a program, every once in a while, the American Bar Association might have a workshop on it, depending on who the presenter is, whether it be an attorney or a mental health professional, depending on the kind of information. So it's really important for people to understand how complex
Yeah.
and this subject is, and a lot of common sense just simply doesn't work.
Right.
So
Exactly.
well,
I think that's
a good example of that would be if the child's rejecting a parent, there must be a good reason.
right. By that parent's actions.
Right. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh, he must have done something.
The
Right.
rejected parent must have done something. I've actually seen decisions made by courts that said they didn't know exactly what went on, but they know something must have happened for the child to be behaving this way. And that's just simply a fallacy.
Right. I just sort of to go back, maybe even a little more an introductory level, maybe one way to think about this is when you're selecting an attorney, how do you select an attorney? Let's say from a targeted parent or unfavored parent looking for an attorney to expose what's going on, how do you do that? Versus if an attorney is representing an alienating parent and they are aware of that, what are their obligations?
Mm.
And just sort of addressing all that because it's not the ethics and that guide attorneys is very different than the ethics that guides, say, a mental health professional.
Right. Attorneys supposedly are supporting the court in terms of what's in the best interest of children. However, they are representing their client.
Exactly.
And so that's really their first obligation. And they can get in trouble with their licensing boards of the associations that um, if they don't follow through on that, right,
Yeah.
wrong, or indifferent.
Right, exactly. So, in other words, an attorney, if I'm an attorney, which I'm not, but if I'm an attorney and I'm representing somebody who is an alienating parent, the I must still represent their interest. I mean, Richard Gardner used to say an attorney for an alienating parent should try to guide that parent to behave and not act in an alienating way, which is unlikely to be successful. But I mean, that's a real issue. How so? An attorney can be sued for not being for being inadequately biased. In other words, if an attorney is obligated to be biased in favor of their client's position. However, a mental health professional can be sued for being biased. So it's kind of the opposite. So
Right.
I think it's just important as a starting point to try to make that clear because you're going to be navigating that depending, presumably everybody who's listening to this is a targeted parent. Uh, so being aware of that, I think is kind of important.
Mm. That would, you bring up a good point. The people that are listening to these podcasts, it would really be helpful to us if you could use Dr. Evans at naopas.com or Dr. Bone at naopas.com to let us know your position in these kind of cases, the kind of information that you'd be interested in. So
Yeah, that's
I
very,
probably
but
should have
yeah,
said this at the beginning or the end of this, but it just struck me that you said, well, most of these people are probably targeted parents. They may be,
yeah,
but I would hope that there's other types of audience
right.
uh, participants on this kind of in this kind of podcast.
No,
So
I think that's very helpful though to get what are areas that would be helpful.
exactly. And again, kind of knowing who the people are that we're speaking to, if you are a targeted parent, if you have an attorney, well, we can't give you legal advice, but your attorney needs to be actively involved in terms of protecting the best interest of your children in the sense of dealing with this topic of alienation. Many parents are more educated, we talked about this before, are more
Yeah.
educated and expert in the area of parental alienation than sometimes their attorneys and many times the mental health people that are involved in the case. Parents, they know more about it. And
Yes.
and so attorneys need to pay attention.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because that is one of the things that happens quite often and kind of predictably is that you're going to be dealing with it. Attorney is, I mean, here I'm the client, I'm the parent, and I've read all this stuff, and attorneys are now telling me, "Oh, that's not true." I mean, that's something that has to be dealt with, and it usually means you probably need a different attorney.
Right. Or get your one that you have educated.
Right.
Many times in my cases where if an attorney is interested enough, um, we've got training courses at CLEs by the Florida Bar on the website, NAOPAS. I want to educate the attorneys. They need
Yeah.
to know how to deal with this. You're going to find frequently that the favored parent's attorney may know enough about how to defeat the concept, then the favored parent knows how to represent somebody who's been alienated. And so it's really important to be knowledgeable about this subject.
Yes.
I think one of the things you mentioned just a second ago is that there are some attorneys that actually believe that this doesn't even exist,
Exactly.
and including attorneys that represent the targeted parent. So, oh, this is just a rumor. This is a defunct. That stuff is still going on. When I give testimony, how many times do I run into an opposing attorney that says, that's a concept that's really been debunked. It doesn't really exist. It's fake science.
Right.
That's been shown to be. And the response to that is, you're wrong.
Right.
I'm sorry. There is 1,000, well over 1,000 published peer-reviewed journals now, articles. The Florida Bar, the American Bar Association have articles and books already on this topic. You have professional associations that represent and make comment on this particular topic. So
Yeah.
it's
You know,
alive and well, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I think another thing, the first article about parental was published in 1984, 85 rather, by Richard Gardner. And then, and a lot of attorneys are probably relying on older information. However, there was an article published, maybe it was, I guess, 2 years ago, Jennifer Harmon, that went through, there's been an explosion of research about parental alienation in the last 10 years. And the likelihood of the attorney is aware of that is not very
Slim to
great,
none. Yeah.
probably.
Well,
You know,
according to Jennifer, it was like 40%.
yeah,
I believe it's 40% of all published work on the topic of parental alienation occurred since 2016.
yeah.
And
I mean,
that's a peer-reviewed journal, and she published that information in.
right.
So
So I
there's
think
been an
that's a factor
explosion.
too. Yeah.
So your attorney needs to know that A, it exists, and there are specific strategies. One thing that you do, Mike, is you do a lot of coaching of attorneys in
Right.
terms of helping them strategize in their cases. What's one of the first things that you tell an attorney?
What's the first time? Okay. Say
What's
again.
one of the first things that you might tell an attorney that hires you as a consultant? What is one of the key things that you tell people?
Well, one of the key things, I orient them to the five-factor model. I mean, that's sort of the state of the art of how we identify this sort of thing. And the fourth factor, and we can go through this if we need to, but the fourth factor is based on research of 17 alienating behaviors. So that's what the first point I try to make to an attorney is, what I say to them, the other factors quickly are a prior positive relationship between the alienated parent and the child, an absence of really clinically significant bad parenting or abuse. And now the child is expressing factor three, is expressing resistance, refusal to see that parent. But factor four, that's the alienating strategies engaged in by alienating parents. And that's what I tell them in factor five are the symptoms of when the child becomes alienated. But I tell them, we hear the term signal and noise, and I tell the attorney that the key is the fourth factor, the alienating behaviors. That's the signal. Everything else is noise. So to get them focused on that in that area, because once they sort of understand that what they're dealing with is sort of like litigation 101, they're going to be, basically asking questions, direct and cross-examination questions that expose these kinds of alienating behaviors, because alienating parents will 99 times out of 100 claim to be supportive of the child and the other parent. I mean, that's the predictable lie that we can count on. But you can use that lie to expose it, to basically set them up to predictably answer a question that will later be revealed as being a lie using the evidence, which typically are those 17 behaviors. So
Well, and
that's sort of in a nutshell, I guess.
and I think in terms of those 17 behaviors, that's a recognized pattern of
Yes,
behavior. And it's not just, I think one of the key things to help a court understand is that a parent executing these 17 strategies has been probably doing these things over a period of time. This isn't a one-time deal of
right,
an angry outburst, and then that was the end of it that never occurred again, ever
right.
again. There's a
This is not
pattern.
that. This is not, yeah,
There's a pattern of behavior that has a linear progression and typically it gets worse. I've got a case now where the favored parent has filed something like 13 um, um, motions to a court to prevent a parent from having contact with the children. I mean, but it's like it's a machine gun operation.
Yeah,
It's one thing after another to stop this parent from having contact, and raise the specter of abuse, and a period of time where that parent will have no contact
exactly.
until
One of the
proven
things
otherwise.
one of the things, another thing, one of the basic things that will sometimes impact an attorney when it's sort of explained is, like you said, a linear progression. Historically, what's happened? What's the relationship been like? And sort of create a before and after picture. I think that's very important because if you don't do the before picture when things were good, because the way our brains are wired, the person listening to this is likely to think it's always been bad. And so
Right,
you have to show the contrast, the before and after picture, and also point out, and I find this to be helpful with attorneys, to say, look, these changes didn't happen when the parent was seeing the other was the child was seeing that other parent. In other words, the changes happen not in the targeted parent's presence, but in their absence. The changes occurred on the alienating parent's watch, typically in the absence of the other, and that's an important man, that environment will just take off, and that's typically what happens. But unless you know that, unless you know to look, how were things before, and unless that's really brought up forcefully in court, the judge is likely to think, oh, this has always been bad.
right, exactly. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people use and it's a mental health people mostly will use the whole idea of a high conflict divorce.
Yes,
And the high conflict divorce kind of connotes that, oh, it's both parties.
right,
These are just two people that just can't get along.
right.
And
I've heard
then,
judges say that, and they'll misperceive because it looks like that from at least you look at it at the surface. And I've heard judges say, "Oh, these two just hate each other more than they love their children." I've heard that well, many times actually
right, right.
over the years.
So the idea is to stay away from that terminology of high conflict divorce,
Yeah.
or if it does show up, explain that that doesn't necessarily mean both people are at fault for the child's rejection.
Yeah, I think that's really is an important point because it's very likely to be assumed that way. That's why back to one of the basic things I tell attorneys, there are really two things that need to happen for the court to get one of these cases right. And that is the alienating parent's behavior must be exposed and they will predictably lie, which opens the door to expose them as long as you have the evidence. Uh,
Right. And
so
it's I've heard you say that before, that you got to expose that behavior
Yes.
in
The
order.
other thing that has to happen, I think, is the targeted, the unfavored parent, that they have to be rebranded. And I think the best mechanism, the best method to do that is through that parent's direct testimony, and have the attorney walk them through with artifacts, with pictures, with cards, with things, and walk them through their before relationship with each child. Because if that's done adequately and the judge really is comfortable, if you think about what happens, once a judge says, "Oh, this guy's okay" or "this woman's okay," but the allegations, the negative, the criticisms keep coming, they land in a very different place. Once the judge says, "Wait a minute," then they begin to realize, "Wait a minute, this is," and the whole case can really be understood as false accusations. That's really the core of so much of this.
Well, and one of the keys, just sort of that while we're looking at a linear progression of behavior by the favored parent, the faults, the the foibles of the targeted parent, they need
Yes.
to be looked at. That usually, in all likelihood, they are single incidents of a maybe an outburst of anger or an inappropriate behavior. How many times do I tell
Oh, yeah.
attorneys and everybody else testimony that, these are, first of all, we're talking about human beings that screw up, and virtually every favored parent, every rejected parent does or says something that usually is inappropriate or damaging or somehow or other exacerbated to the
Right.
rejection of the child. But the court has to understand that this was a single incident. This
Right.
was an outlier. This wasn't a normal pattern of behavior for this person.
Not a
And that
pattern.
needs to be sold. That needs to be sold to the court so that they
Yes.
understand it. Oh, maybe there's two incidents. Maybe there's whatever. One of the things that people have to understand too is how stressful and how damaging it is to
Oh my
have
God.
your
Yeah.
child testify that you're this horrible, terrible person, and they never really loved you, and they never had a good time with you. How many times do we hear that?
Oh,
It's
many,
like
many.
it's over
Yeah.
and over and over again. We could talk about that in a second, but the key here is that the court needs to understand that this is not a pattern for this person. They're
Right.
not necessarily narcissistic. They don't necessarily need to go to anger management programs, etc. Do some people have to go to anger management? Yes. I think one of the keys is that people need to understand, and targeted parents need to understand, that the child's behavior is a form of adjustment for that child to live in that kind of an environment. They are not allowed to demonstrate love and affection towards the targeted parent. If they do, they're very fearful of what can happen to them.
That
They know this. People say, well, the child hates me. The child doesn't hate you.
right.
What you've got an attached relationship with a child. That attachment doesn't go away.
Right.
That's there forever. Okay. And the court needs to understand that this child is behaving in a way that allows them to survive with that favored parent.
And that's another thing. Sometimes, again, back to your earlier question about how do you sort of coach attorneys, basically to let them know that uh, the well, as you said, the if there are occasional reactions, negative reactions, they're not emblematic they're the exception, not the rule, because the other side will present it as being the rule, the
Right.
pattern that's always there. So being able to show that not to be the case is really, really important. One of the things that happens that just occurred to me if a targeted parent has an attorney that doesn't really understand parental alienation, but they don't understand that they don't understand it, that whole kind of thing. I've seen this more than once. Sometimes those attorneys, because the targeted parent can be kind of a high maintenance client because there's so much crisis going on. But sometimes attorneys will start to believe the allegations against that parent
Mhm.
and begin to coach them in ways that are inconsistent with what's the best interest of the child. So I always advise people be on the lookout for that. If
Right.
they start, advising things that would don't expose that, absolutely don't,
Well,
and run the other way.
how many targeted parents step back and they say, well, what did I do? I must have done something. And so
Yeah.
many times they're dealing with guilt in terms of, well, they can't put their finger on it exactly, but maybe it was the time that they yelled at the child or they disciplined the child or they spanked the child. And so, they hyperthink, they overthink about what
Yes.
they could have, would have, should have done.
And
And
if,
and if
yes,
you got an attorney that's kind of along those lines, well, now you got two people sitting back saying, well, you shouldn't have done that, and maybe that's what's going on. You have to understand that the relationship between a child and a parent is how do you say it? Children put their parents on a pedestal, no matter what they do, no matter how they
until the
behave.
children get older.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
even
kidding.
then, I, a child does not reject a parent. It
Right.
just doesn't, it's not instinctual. It's not a common occurrence because a parent misbehaves or says something or even behaves in a certain way. Okay.
It-
Those children do not reject that parent. Okay. Well, they're going to say, well, what about somebody, even a parent who's in terms of a substance abuser? Okay.
right.
That's a big flag for courts. Oh, you're a substance abuser, so therefore you can't see your kid. We have books and therapists in terms of children who have been raised by an alcoholic parent. They stay with that parent. They
Yeah.
support that parent. And so the literature on children who have been abused,
Yeah.
genuinely abused by a parent, that literature demonstrates very clearly, and it's a very robust body of literature that says these kids will not reject that parent. They want to maintain a relationship with
They
that
want to go
parent.
home.
They'll feel guilty about what that parent did because they'll blame themselves.
Exactly.
They won't blame the parent. So there's a distinguishing
Well,
characteristic,
that's a
by the
great
way,
point, Bob.
between the child who's been genuinely abused and who somehow some professionals will talk about estrangement as a function of that versus the child who's been alienated. The alienated child will claim that they've been abused and will hate that parent, reject that parent. The child um, who has been genuinely abused wants to maintain a relationship with that
Right.
abusive parent.
Well, when children are genuinely abused, they tend to believe they did something to bring it on. There's something about them that's unlovable. So
Exactly.
there's a lot of self-critique, aggressive self-critique that's going on all the time.
Well, I
And
say the
so,
children are egocentric.
yeah,
Young children in particular, they create their world. Everything they've done is they did it.
yeah,
Okay. They make things appear, they make things disappear.
right, right, exactly, exactly.
So it's kind of it's an interesting phenomenon to deal with. It just it needs to be taught. It needs to be taught to professionals who are involved in this arena, and it's a very critical thing. Attorneys need to learn about it. Attorneys become judges, so
Yep,
they bring that lack of information. Oh, they think they've seen it all, but they don't understand the underlying dynamics of these kind of cases. And there's a body of professionals out there that want to sell the idea that both parents are at fault, or
right,
we have to look at every single psychodynamic of a child is how resilient the child is, how resistant the child is to this, and yeah, we have to look at some of those things, but it's almost like we can triage it. If you got a
right.
child that's rejecting a parent, you need to dig into why is that child rejecting that
Because
parent?
that is so incredibly unusual.
Does that make any sense? Does it
Yeah,
make any sense that the child is rejecting that parent? What has that parent done to
right.
reject that child? And you have kids that even adolescents, okay, yeah, we have to make a distinguishing dynamic between the child who's seeking autonomy versus a child who's rejecting and hating a parent. But
Right.
even adolescents don't really want to reject that parent. They
No,
rely on that parent.
right. Exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
and while we're on that topic, we really got to say, adolescents are not in the position to make a decision on which parent they want to live with. Okay.
No,
They don't have the maturity, the cognitive experience. We talk about people don't mature until around the ages of 25.
right.
Okay. So a 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old is not in a position to say, oh, I want to go live with my mother or my father because of whatever rationale they want to have. So picking up on the idea that kids are not in a position to make a decision on who they want to live with.
Yeah, I've heard you comment in the past about developmentally during that period of time of brain development where that 15-year-old brain needs 10 more years to mature, they're um,
Well, I basically said it that neurologically they haven't developed to a point where they're uh, you know, cognizant of the effects of their decisions. In other words, there's an executive function that occurs as we mature, and
right.
that isn't fully developed until you're into your mid 20s.
It's
And the idea is, do I understand the consequences of my behavior? Do I understand how that's going to have an effect on me and others?
Also, during that period of time, this is that developmentally, the part of their brain that has to do with empathy and compassion and so forth, that part is actually pruned back. That's why adolescents oftentimes are described as being kind of self-centered and a little bit, and unpleasant, so to speak, because the part of their brain that has to do with addressing other people's feelings and concerns really is kind of pruned back, and that comes back later as the brain develops. So putting validity onto a 15-year-old's desire, oh, I want to do this, and is perilous. But that's one that oftentimes courts don't understand at
Oh
all.
no. Oh no. And it's sold well. They're mature enough, they're intelligent
Right.
enough, they're responsible enough. Look, and the way I explain this in testimony frequently is that, we have child labor laws. Okay. A
Yeah.
15, 16, 17-year-old, okay, sometimes needs their parents' permission to get a job or go work. They can't join the army or go join the military.
Yes.
They can't go into bars. They can't drink. They can't drive in many places. They can't get a driver's license, and they can't make a lot of decisions that unless they have an adult's permission. Adolescence is a period of time when children are very influenced by their peers. They're very influenced by decisions that are not thought out very thoroughly. And
Yes.
so that's why parents need to monitor the kinds of information that they're watching on the internet, the kind of information that they're using on their phone, etc., so that they understand what that child's exposing themselves to. Um, just because somebody is bright and articulate and verbal doesn't mean that they're in a position to make a decision that has a lifelong consequence. Yeah,
Yes.
Richard Warshak, just not too long ago, talked about how the average, the average length of time, he had one case, the average length of time for a child who untreated, no intervention, alienated child takes about 22 years before they circle back to that parent. Recently, he came up with, he counted another case where it was 27 years. So when an alienated child exists and is allowed to make a decision to go live with a favored or alienating parent, the likelihood that that child's going to circle back to the rejected parent is getting slimmer and slimmer.
Right.
Part of it may have to do with our culture, it may have to do with our society, the way our society has, I don't want to use the word evolved because it's probably not really a positive thing, but basically the child is loses a parent.
Yeah.
And it's worse than the death of a parent
Yes.
because that
Because
parent is,
because yeah, because they're also the murderer.
they're involved. They
Yeah.
made the decision. And at some point in time, that's going to be brought back to their attention, not by the targeted or the rejected parent, but the alienating parent has
Right.
got a mission. And that mission is to segregate or sever that relationship between that child and the other parent. And that child has then become complicit in that decision. Oh, so well, now we'll go back to say, well, they were young. They shouldn't, they will use their youth now as an excuse for that.
Right.
Okay. But at the same time, we paid attention to them in terms of making that decision. So it's a very complex area.
Yeah. And again, back to the thing about lawyers, it's there's a lot of forensic psychologists that don't have a good understanding of this.
No,
A lot.
no. Actually, I
So
heard a
to
testimony of a psychologist, PhD psychologist, had a testimony of a psychologist to say that the childhood of the favored or alienating parent plays no role in their behavior today. Now, that's a
wow.
psychologist saying that the childhood of a person doesn't play a role in their who they are today as an adult. That's astounding.
Yes, absolutely it is.
And,
Yes.
and people listen to that.
Yes,
It's
they
like,
certainly
well,
do.
and it doesn't get challenged.
Yeah.
Now, I would hope that somebody, even if you're not a psychologist, you would sit back and say, that just can't be.
Yeah.
That just can't be. No
Right.
matter what happens to you as a child, is that going to affect you as an adult?
I mean,
That's insane.
it's kind of astounding. But judges are listening, and so again, back to the lawyer, I think it really is important to finding a lawyer. You find one that's open to, if they don't understand that, they're willing to say that, and they're willing to learn. I mean, and some lawyers are really good at that.
Sure. You-
Some are not. So you have
And
to
then,
select.
and the favored parent's attorney, they they need to get a sense of what's happening in this case. That truly, unless they come to believe that that targeted parent is so guilty that they don't deserve to have a relationship with the child, and and that's kind of hard to believe, but they do that. They
Yeah.
become strong advocates for their clients, and
And
at
this,
some, I'm sorry.
well, what I was gonna say, this is a little off topic, but we've talked in the past about the role of personality disorder. So if you have a personality disordered alienating parent and they find an attorney who has a complementary personality disorder, I mean, you've got a perfect storm there. And that does happen. I mean, that really
Oh
does
yeah.
happen. And these attorneys really start to behave as though it's their life and not their clients.
And it doesn't have to be a diagnosed personality disorder. You could be
Right.
talking about personality traits. So
Right.
there's a narcissistic personality disorder, but there are narcissistic traits. There are borderline personality disorder, but there are borderline traits.
Right.
And those have a very strong influence in terms of behavior and how one interacts with other people.
Right. That's a great point, Bob. So the gee, nobody's been officially diagnosed as being bipolar. That really is
How many
that.
times do you hear that?
Yes, many, many, many. And you really have to look at the behavior. I mean, a lot of this says you got to look at the behavior. That's really what tells the story.
Right. So anything else in terms, like I say, for you're a favored or alienating parent and you're represented by an attorney. I think at one point I actually heard Richard Gardner say, you should fire that client.
Yeah,
But that's probably not going to happen.
I've not seen that happen. I'm still waiting for that to happen, I guess. But yeah, that was his position. Yes.
So at the same time, while you're not firing that client, if you're an attorney, how about instructing your client?
Right.
Say, look,
Well,
I
and
we
and one good way for an attorney to do this is to say, look, if you keep doing that, the court's going to come down on you. And that's sort of right for the wrong reasons, maybe.
right.
But nonetheless, to modify the behavior, that's the goal.
There is a presentation that some people do, and they talk about, well, if this was alienation and this was really going on, there's going to be a rebound by the child. His child's going to bounce back and blame you, the alienating parent. That can happen. It's rare, but it
Yes.
can happen.
Yes.
Um, and so that's a good argument for that attorney to say, not so much in terms of the child's going to come back and reject you, but this is not going to go good in front of the court.
Yep. Yep. And so that's the kind of advice that we'd like to hear attorneys representing alienating parents give.
Well, we may not hear it too. I mean,
Right.
that could be
Exactly.
done. That's going to be a client privilege thing.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And
Exactly.
sometimes you hear that afterwards, though. It's kind of funny because
Yeah.
sometimes the attorneys will say something to the other attorney and saying, what was I going to do? I had to represent my client.
Yes.
The
Exactly.
client, the attorney that represents the child, amicus attorneys, I don't know if there's a terminology for them in some jurisdictions.
Yep.
That's an interesting phenomenon
Yeah.
because they're kind of locked into representing their client, i.e., the child. If the child's alienated, the child's going to misrepresent to that attorney their position. And that attorney's going to look at that child and say, well, they're very articulate, they're very bright, they're very responsible, they're all so they must be telling me the truth. And so
Right.
they believe the child and represent the child's wishes, which are usually the alienating parents' wishes, but they're articulating those kind of wishes. They need to understand some of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, minors counsel, attorney for the child. I mean, there's really and state by state, it can vary as my understanding. But in some states, in some jurisdictions, the attorney for the child is supposed to represent whatever the child says and
Right.
not counterbalance that with the best interest of the child. However, somebody who's doing that job responsibly will filter in what the best interests are. Uh, so, I mean, that's kind of what you're up against when so minors counsel in an alienation case can be a big deal and it can be a big problem.
Right. I think one of the keys there is we start looking at the behavior. We talked about looking at the behavior and labeling the behavior. Look for the borrowed scenarios.
Yes.
If you can segregate when you talk to the child separate from the favorite parent's presence, and you start to see and listen to the child, you're going to hear common vocabulary. You're going
Yep.
to hear for verbatim, in many cases, kinds of issues. And maybe that should start to raise an issue.
Right.
Keep it, again, if you understand parental alienation is a form of child abuse. And so you're representing an abused child who's presenting false information, false memories. Um, we talk about contaminated information that they are presenting to the attorney and then ultimately to the court. And that's really important for that attorney to be cognizant of.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We think of it in terms of the capability to stand trial. If you look at the characteristics that courts use in the judicial system, and it's pretty much all over the country, it's pretty very similar in terms of looking at a child's ability to understand the consequences of their behavior. If this was a criminal case, does that person understand the consequences of their behavior? Do they understand what they did was wrong,
Right.
etc.? If you look at those kind of criteria to the alienated child, you come back to an interesting conclusion that maybe I'm representing somebody that really doesn't know what they're talking about. Maybe I'm representing somebody that has been manipulated and programmed, for the want of a better word, brainwashed.
Yep.
I don't know what they do with that. Like you said, their primary responsibility is to say what the child's saying. It would seem to me maybe that's a good conversation to have with a guardian ad litem who could say, hey,
Yeah,
this is what's really happening.
exactly. Yeah. Then that's,
I don't know. That's an interesting phenomenon. How does that work? If you're a child's advocate, you're a child's attorney, and you know that this is what's going on, you don't have any obligation to report that to the court?
I think you do, but I think that's the question that once an attorney understands that they're supporting psychological child abuse, hopefully the attorney would bring that to the court's attention. But sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and there is not a large understanding that this is child abuse.
Yep,
There are people that would refute that information, which doesn't make any sense because it conforms very much to the definitions that
absolutely.
APSAC puts out in terms of what the definition of child maltreatment is.
Yes, absolutely.
So can you think of anything else that we need to talk about?
I think
So we
that I
covered
can't.
the favored parents attorney. We talked about the targeted parents attorney. Um, there are educational programs for attorneys through the American Bar Association. The American Bar Association publishes books on the topic. We know that one attorney is Ashish Joshi. He's got a book out called Litigating Parental Alienation. Oh, by the way, the National Association of Parental Alienation has training programs on its website for
Yep.
attorneys. Um, there are vehicles and avenues for attorneys to learn about this topic. They really need to.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the drum we keep banging on, and hopefully it'll get louder and louder and more heard and
Mhm.
recognized.
Michael, thank you. Appreciate your
Well,
time as
pleasure
usual.
as always, Bob, and we'll do it again.
Yes, we will. Thank you very much.
All right, very good. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.drbobevans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.